As the Secretary General of the International Federation on Ageing, welcome to the first of a series of webinars aimed to inform about the issues of older LGBTQI2S people, but most importantly to connect across multiple disciplines and sectors. The IFA is very proud to be in a co-equal partnership with SAGE, Services and Advocacy for LGBT Elders in the United States. SAGE is the largest and oldest organisation dedicated to improving the lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender older adults. Our partnership also extends to EGAL, who in Canada and broadly works to improve the lives of LGBTQI2S people in Canada and to enhance the global response. The IFA, our mission and our goal is to be a point of connection of experts and expertise, and through that to help influence and shape policy. So we come together with a common goal, and that common goal is to help address inequities in the population of older LGBTQI2S. It's now my great pleasure to hand over the microphone and presentation to Iredell Plant from EGAL. Thank you, Iredell.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. I'm just going to... So I'd like to start off with a quote by Maya Angelou. This is something that we at EGAL start off all of our sessions with. And it says, "Do the best until you can do better. And when you know better, do better." This is a really important insight for us when it comes to engaging in equity work of any kind, because it acknowledges that we're all doing the best we can with the knowledge we have. And it also recognizes that we come from different spaces. So recognizing that we're coming from different spaces, I'd like to lay out some of the terms and concepts. Sorry, I'm just having an issue clicking over the screen. Okay. So I'd like to go over some of the foundational terms and concepts. So this is an acronym that we use here at EGAL. And we basically use it to describe the communities that we are a part of, LGBTQI2S. Some of these terms might be familiar to some of these terms might not. One of the questions that we often get is, what does Two-Spirit mean? So the term Two-Spirit was established in 1990, speaks specifically to Indigenous communities in the North American context. And so the term Two-Spirit was established at a meeting of Two-Spirit individuals from many nations across present-day North America as a shared piece of language to speak about the variety of traditions in which diversity of gender and attraction have historically been valued and honored. Historically, Two-Spirit people often held positions of power within their communities as leaders, healers, and mediators because they were seen as having a gift of holding both masculine and feminine energies within themselves. And I think it's important to recognize that we can't really talk about LGBT issues without also talking about colonialism, because one of the motivations behind the colonial project was to gain access to resources. Two-Spirit people were explicitly targeted in order to access these resources, and also because their ways of being challenged, and also because they challenged the Judeo-Christian worldview imposed by European settlers. So I bring this up to say that even the terms that we use, the language that we use, is very context specific. You know, and so I think it's important to recognize that while we're talking about what it means, the LGBTQI2S experience and its global challenges, even the acronym that we use to describe identity is very much shaped by language, and that language is very much shaped by who holds power and the context around it. Okay, and so speaking of identity, when we talk about identity, it's also important to kind of break it down into 4 major components. So here's this handy tool that we actually use to show this. And it doesn't matter who we show this to. We show it to students, we show it to teachers, we show it to bankers, we show it to policymakers. A lot of folks find this visual breakdown really helpful. So this is a genderbread person. And it essentially kind of talks about sort of these 4 general categories of identities. The first category that I'm going to gloss over really quickly is an assigned sex. So what that means is when a person is born into the world, somebody, usually a doctor or midwife, will kind of look at particular genitals between someone's legs and then declare it's a boy or it's a girl. And so it will write masculine or feminine on your birth certificate and then sort of sends you off into the world. And depending on whether or not you've been assigned that male or female label, there's often a whole bunch of expectations that kind of correspond with what that can mean. Gender identity is a little bit different. So unlike assigned sex, which is defined by someone else's assessment of our physical bodies, gender identity is something that only we can determine for ourselves. And it's based on how we personally experience our relationship to our socially constructed system of gender. So this is why gender identity is something that exists in the brain. Gender expression, on the other hand, is how we express who we are in the world. And it's also how gender is read on our bodies by the people around us. This can be very culturally specific and context specific. And it also is important to recognize that people have many different reasons for why they choose to express their gender or not express their gender in the ways that they do. Sometimes it's an issue of comfort, sometimes it's an issue of access to resources, things like that. And finally, we have sexual attraction. So sexual attraction is something that we might be more familiar with, or the term sexual orientation. We use the term attraction instead of sexual orientation because we recognize that not everyone experiences sexual attraction. There are folks in this world who identify as asexual, for example, who might experience attraction in different ways, but not necessarily sexual attraction. So there you have it. So this is kind of like the 4 components of identity that make up Gendy. And in addition to that, your gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation also can intertwine and intermingle with other components of identity. So we call this social location. These can be things like your ability, your race or ethnicity, the languages you speak, your spirituality, your body size, how you navigate through the world. So all these things interconnect with your gender identity and sexual orientation, and it also influences how you how you navigate through the world, and also how the world perceives you. And with this, we all kind of hold privilege in some ways. We all have like some piece of our identity that can be privileging, and that can look very different depending on context as well. And so I think that this is an important foundation to start when we are talking about aging. So aging is universal. Everyone ages. But depending on your social location, people can actually age very differently. How they navigate through the world can be very different. And so when we're talking about LGBTQI2S seniors, for example, that can look like a lot of different things. So as folks age, they tend to navigate through systems of health and care in different ways, and that can be compounded with homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So an example of that, a couple examples of that can be the fear of accessing healthcare given the history of abuse and institutionalization from that medical system. Or it can look like an absence of care from family of origin because of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Consequently, it can also look like, or conversely rather, it can look like the absence of social programming from LGBTQI2S communities because of erasure and ageism. It can look like someone having to conceal one's identity in order to not be discriminated against or to gain access to systems of healthcare or long-term care. So these are some of the examples. And so because so many institutions that we must navigate through, institutions of healthcare, of civic engagement, of housing, are very context and regional specific. And also at the same time, how queer people are defined, how they're protected is also very context specific. It really, really depends. Like, these are how queer people navigate through these systems are also very context specific. So I made this little introduction short and sweet because I wanted to leave time for the panelists. Is it Leslie good to go? Okay, perfect. So our first speaker is Leslie. So Leslie Lee Kam is a world majority Brown, Trini, Carib, Callaloo Dyke, differently abled, and an elder. Leslie has been out as a dyke in the community since 1976, and as an advocate for queer people of color, she lives her life from an anti-oppression perspective. Leslie enjoys a cold beverage and a hot lime anytime. So I'm going to open the floor with two questions for you, Leslie. So my first question to you is, what issues, challenges, and barriers do older LGBTQ I2S people face in your particular region, and what are some promising approaches to supporting these rights of older LGBTQ I2S people?
Thank you, Eritel, and good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can all hear.
Okay. So in terms of the first question, the barriers that we are facing, I'm going to speak about Toronto. So in Toronto right now, there is no actual care facility where the mandate is LGBTQ inclusive. It's supposed to be happening, and I am with the organization, the Senior Pride Network, along with working with the GAL, and we are advocating to make sure that the staff is being trained in the 10 long-term care facilities in Toronto, and these facilities are funded by the City of Toronto. And that kind of training is not happening. You had spoken earlier when you went through the slides about isolation and visibility. We're also looking at the fear, the oppression that we have faced as older LGBTQ seniors. Back in the day, the word queer wasn't being used. So now somebody who is in their 80s and 90s, to hear that word is not very good. It's very oppressive. Many of us, including myself, have had addictions, and that's another factor that's taken into account. One of the other barriers that we are facing is once we are in any kind of care facility, because of the lack of training, we are being forced back into the closet. And Toronto right now is the most diverse city in the world. Unfortunately, that kind of diversity is not reflected in the care facilities that we are seeking out. And in many of our cultures, we do not go into care facilities. We are cared for by our families if we have any, and many of us don't have families anymore. Myself as an example, my 3 brothers and my father accepted me, but at that time when I came out, I was living with my mother, and I had to move out just to keep myself safe. So most of us have chosen families. And the other thing I wanted to point out, in terms of coming out, that's a very North American concept. So coming from Trinidad, in the West Indies, nobody comes out. And in many countries such as Africa and in Latin America, coming out is not something that's done. People just sort of know that you are there. And the other thing that many of us are afraid of is when we flee the countries from which we have come to Canada, many of those countries, it is legal to kill us. And I'm going to be blunt about that. So we face a lot of oppression and fear and stigma in terms of even trying to identify ourselves as being LGBTQ. So the Senior Pride Network is an advocacy organization which is trying to open doors for equity. You know, when you talked about equity earlier on, in terms of the kind of care that we want to receive, and we would like to be treated with respect. You don't have to accept us, but at least respect us. And many of us are going back into the closet. EGAL has just put out a great 3-poster series about us going back into the closet. And another huge piece is the financial constraints that we face. Many of us don't have access to pensions, so we are forced to live on our own and depend on ourselves, mostly to take care of ourselves, which is kind of unusual, or to depend on our chosen families. And in rural areas, so I will talk about rural areas separate from Toronto, there is very little access to any kind of care facility where there's any training of the staff in terms of LGBTQ inclusion. To answer your second question, I am proud to say that working with the Senior Pride Network, we are doing a lot of outreach in terms of reaching seniors in their various communities, and that's something we find that is important to do. A lot of community networking, and we've just done a series called Tell It Like It Is, Aging and Activism, Chosen Family, Aging as a Person of Color, and Aging as Trans, Aging as while disabled. So we're trying in as many ways as possible to reach out to seniors who are not in the mainstream sector and who don't have access to mainstream forms of communication. We work very closely with long-term care homes. We are now reaching out to the retirement home sector. And what I find interesting, whenever we reach out to the private retirement home sector, they tell us there are no queer seniors here, which is interesting because we are there. And according to Community, which is an organization in British Columbia, 1 in 16 seniors is LGBTQ, which is quite a high number. We are finding also in Ontario that many organizations have made the commitment to do their own training in terms of LGBTQ Inclusion 101 and how they're working with queer seniors. So basically, that's what's going on from my point of view. For me, in order for change to happen, we have to work from the top down in terms of changing the infrastructure. So the Senior Pride Network, myself, we are sitting on a couple of government ministries, Ministry of Health primarily, which is in charge of many of the long-term care homes and retirement homes. And we are working towards changing policy. Something else that we are working on that might seem a bit odd, but we are working with Pride, Toronto Pride, to make sure that queer seniors are included, because it's queer seniors who built Toronto Pride and many of the different prides around the world. So that's really important that we are acknowledged in terms of the work we have done to bring Pride to where it is today. And what else? Yes, we're also working with hospitals and home care agencies and long-term care, private long-term care facilities in terms of LGBTQ 101 training, just to make everybody aware that we are queer and we are there. And personally, I work with Bridgepoint Active Rehab Hospital, and there are many patients there who are queer but are afraid to come out, and that's something else that's my goal, is to make sure we're all out to the point where we can receive decent health care the same as everybody else without having to go back into the closet. So that's my time. Hello?
Well, thank you so much, Leslie, for your thoughts. Really appreciate that.
Welcome.
So our next panelist is Carla Acuna. So Carla is from Costa Rica and works at CPAC. She's in charge of political advocacy for the human rights of LGBTQI2S. She has a degree in political science from the Universidad de Costa Rica and is currently studying social work. She is also working as a researcher on the LGBTQI2S senior situation in Central America and develops trainings and awareness processes for elderly care and healthcare facilities. Carla, welcome.
Good morning. At CPEC in Costa Rica, we're grateful for the opportunity to participate in this webinar and to join the discussion about a topic that matters to all of us, the situation of elderly LGBTIQ2S people, the inequality and the challenges they encounter in a society that still hasn't been able to integrate them as human rights subjects. Our interest in participating here has its origins in our research at various senior citizens care centers at Costa Rica that took place in 2015 in association with our partners, SMULES in El Salvador and AHMNP in Panama. We identified concerns and needs regarding the health and care of LGBTI seniors and the barriers they faced to access these services in Costa Rica, Panama, and El Salvador. To accomplish this, we analyzed the existing laws regarding health care and protection for elderly people in general and applied a questionnaire in care and health centers. In addition, we also interviewed elder LGBTI people. Among our findings, we realized that although there are laws that protect senior citizen rights in all three countries, there's no law regarding specific needs of elderly LGBTI people. We also found out that none of these three countries acknowledged the same-sex union or have any laws regarding gender identity. All this causes a great vulnerability for older people in countries in which age as well as sexual orientation and gender identity are common causes for discrimination. The interviews with health and care centers demonstrate that there's a vast information gap among the center employees. Myths and stereotypes regarding sexuality of elderly people still predominate. For instance, there's a general belief that homosexuality in seniors does not exist, or there's an assumption that that is a mental disease and that their sexual life is already concluded. Hence, centers do not have any facility or room for couples, nor do they give couples information about safer sex and protection methods. In addition, these people are left in a vulnerable positions anyways, since due to the lack of awareness of these matters, health and care centers prefer to deny admission to LGBTI seniors. Since these centers aren't public, they can decide whom they admit and whom they don't. Among elderly LGBTI people concerns, we found that they fear not being protected by any laws in regards to their sexual orientation and gender identity, causing them to think that they don't have any labor, pension, housing, and health care rights. In terms of senior care, they are afraid of having to rely on senior housing and caretakers because they know that they will be denied admission or they will suffer discrimination, and a scenario that could have already happened within their own families, which in many cases have already pushed them away, left them alone with no partners or kids. As consequence of mentioned results, CPAC noticed some of the common issues of senior citizens in Central America, among others. Just a minute, I'm trying to invisibility of elderly LGBTI people and persistence of heterosexism. We verified that no one health and care center nor authorities in charge of caring for elder people have made any effort to include LGBTI people needs. on awareness of LGBTI senior citizens' needs. Both in care centers and health centers, there's a lack of knowledge of specific needs that have to be considered when treating an LGBTI person. They are assumed to be heterosexual, thus excluding them from the system. Isolation. LGBTI people in Central America have been living in fear of rejection because of the conservatism that prevails in these countries, causing many people to form heterosexual relationships and to hide their those people who decide to come out at advanced age after they lived decades pretending to be heterosexuals risk stronger rejection from their families, peers, and society. Care Center for Elderly People. Societies all over the world are facing a continuous process of demographic aging. The public policies in our countries do not include comprehensive aging programs as prepared for the growth of the elderly population, and as part of this situation of the elderly LGBTI population. Our policies and programs are out of date when it comes to human rights and new models of active aging. In the region, the attention of the elderly population is only addressed in an asylum system, which makes it difficult to include new programs of care for LGBTI elders. Senior citizens suffer from different kinds of vulnerabilities, but if you are an elderly LGBTI person, maybe with HIV or an STD, the discrimination increases and the care centers do not find themselves prepared to attend them. Rights. In Central America, there is no law that officially recognizes a relationship between the same-sex partners. So, the partners cannot live together in any care center, and according to the rules, they cannot accept visits from same-sex partners. The LGBTI elderly, like all LGBTI population in our countries, have patrimonial vulnerability. For instance, in case of death, property acquired together between a same-sex couple will not.
It seems that it seems that Carla has the line has dropped out for Carla. So I'm wondering whether we could just get some brief comments from Michael and perhaps Iridel on what's just been said. And if we can't get Carla back on the line, we can just move on to Michael, if that's okay, Michael. So do you have any general comments, Michael?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to, should I move into my presentation and then I can...
Yeah.
And then if, once Carla joins, we can bring her back in. I'm happy to stop.
Great. That sounds a great idea. So I'll just hand it back to Virginia and Iridel so that you can start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. So I will introduce Michael shortly, but before I do, I again just want to reiterate, Jane, and say I invite people to send any questions that they might have through the chat box. Virginia is going to be moderating the questions, and so yeah, if you have any questions. So next we have Michael Adams. So Michael Adams is the Chief Executive Officer of SAGE, Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders, the oldest and largest organization in the United States dedicated to transforming the LGBT aging experience. In partnership with SAGE, in partnership with SAGE affiliates across the U.S., SAGE serves countless LGBT older people nationally via technical assistance, trainings, and services, as well as advocacy at every level of government. Michael, a graduate of Stanford Law School and Harvard College, previously was the Director of Education and Public Affairs for Lambda Legal. Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and look forward to this conversation. I'm sorry we lost our colleague Carla, and hopefully she will be back with us shortly. let me see if I can succeed in advancing this slide here. Okay, I'm having some difficulty. Okay, maybe that does it. Okay, there we go. Great. Okay, so whoops, I've got one too many here. So let me see if I can make it go. There we go. Okay. I thought it might be helpful to start with placing what the comments I would share in the context of what's happening in U.S. society in terms of the aging of the population. In our country, the population is aging very, very rapidly. Historically, we thought of the population mix as essentially forming a pyramid with younger generations forming the largest part of the population at the bottom, and the pyramid gradually getting narrower and narrower as we reach the top and reach older people. That's very much changed. That's very much changed, as you can see by this particular slide. And so we're working within a rapidly aging society. You know, as aging advocates, this context creates, from our perspective, an opportunity to address LGBTQ aging issues from the perspective of older adults as a highly important asset to society. As a growing part of the population, as a growing part of the contributors to our society. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen in the United States is that more conservative forces, these days epitomized by the Trump administration, often frame the growing number of older adults in our country as a burden on society rather than as an asset. And we think that's a very unfortunate context in which to be having this conversation. And if anything, the just defeated proposal around healthcare reform in the United States was really a good and unfortunate example of a policy proposal that really was treating older adults as a burden rather than as the asset they are. So let me talk a little bit about the particular challenges that we see among LGBT older adults in the United States, because there are a variety. And one is what we often talk about as the cumulative effects of lifetimes of discrimination, disempowerment, and marginalization, which results among many LGBT older adults in disproportionately high levels of poverty and quite significant health disparities. And so, for example, in the United States, older lesbians are twice as likely as older Americans in general to live in poverty. LGBT elders of color and transgender elders are much more likely than older Americans to live in poverty. Older gay men, the story is somewhat different, are only slightly more likely to live in poverty than older Americans in general. We also see very substantial health disparities and a much higher level of grappling with serious health conditions among LGBTQ older adults. This certainly an important part of that is centers around HIV. In our country, more than 50% of people who are living with HIV are 50 and older. But the story only starts there. We also see substantial disparities in mental health diagnoses, higher levels of mental health diagnoses as a result of what we sometimes call minority stress, the stressors associated with living in a society that is marked by substantial discrimination and marginalization and ostracism of LGBTQ folks. Similarly, for similar reasons, we see higher levels of substance abuse among LGBT older adults. And that the health disparities and health conditions become even more significant and more complex when we look at the intersections of identity. So, for example, in the United States, African American older adults are twice as likely to receive a dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis as older Americans in general. Latino older adults are 50% more likely to receive such a diagnosis. So older adults who are living at the intersections of LGBT experiences and identities and Latino and or African American experiences and identities are, deal with an exacerbating impact of health disparities and health conditions. A second set of challenges that we see in LGBT aging revolves around social isolation and thin support networks. In the United States, LGBT older adults are 4 times less likely to be parents. So they're 4 times less likely to have adult children in their lives to help provide support and care in their later years in a country where adult children, along with partners, are the primary caregivers for elders. LGBT older adults are twice as likely to be single and living alone, and are much more likely in our country to be disconnected from their families of origin. This leads to thin support networks, thin social networks, and those thin support networks are then exacerbated by a high level of invisibility of elders and LGBT communities themselves as a result of ageism in our own communities. So we see, really acute challenges with social isolation and thin support networks, and that reality really then links directly into a third set of challenges which revolve around the lack of equity in access to services and supportive programs and unequal treatment under the law. So we have a population, an LGBTQ aging population, that because of social isolation, thin support networks, higher levels of poverty, and health disparities, has a far greater need for elder services and elder care, and yet in fact has experiences barriers in accessing that care and services as a result of discrimination, as a result of a lack of cultural competency on the part of providers, and as a result of inequitable allocation of public funding for those services. It is worth noting that we have made progress over the last decade in that regard. Certainly under the Obama administration, we saw substantial progress with regard to LGBT inclusion in federal aging programs, in federally sponsored research and things of that nature. Unfortunately, in the early days of the Trump administration, we are seeing an effort to roll back that progress. And as we speak, we are fighting an effort by the Trump administration to erase LGBT elders from the most important federal survey that determines how federally supported elder services are allocated and who they reach, which is a very, very dangerous sign about where this administration may be going in terms of its approach to LGBTQ elders. I wanted to flag that the context in which we're having this conversation in the United States is a context of a rapid demographic shift, not only in terms of the aging of the population, but in terms of our country becoming a far more diverse country. So what we see now is that 1 in 5 U.S. adults who are 65 and older is a person of color. By 2040, that is going to change to 1 in 3. And that really provides much more context and texture to conversations around LGBTQ aging, since more and more older Americans will be really aging at the intersection of multiple identities and social experiences. So just a couple of words about what we, our response of our organization to this, to this scenario and this context. I think it's important to note that as SAGE and partner organizations have emerged over the last decades to work with and on behalf of LGBTQ older adults, while we recognize the many challenges that this community of elders faces, our organizational orientation is really around building on the resiliencies and the strengths and the power of our constituents. We are an organization that was started by LGBTQ elders themselves. We have from the beginning, through our roots and our history and to this day, embraced the notion of nothing about us without us, that elders themselves are leaders who pay people, and that they continue to have a vital leadership role to play. So, in partnership with our elder constituents and leaders, since we were founded in 1978, we have launched a number of first-time, so to speak, programs in the United States, including companionship programs for isolated elders, support groups, LGBT-friendly senior centers, LGBT-friendly elder housing, a partnership with the U.S. government to provide training and technical assistance and increase cultural competency for aging service providers, a strong focus on policy advocacy to make aging policy in the U.S. more LGBT inclusive. And I would say that an important aspect of that is much of our policy advocacy work uses an intersectional approach and is done in partnership with a diverse set of communities through a national coalition called the Diverse Elders Coalition that brings together advocates from many people of color communities as well. SAGE's new strategic plan, which was launched in 2016, includes for the first time a global component to our work, and to that end, we're very excited about the partnership we formed with the International Federation on Aging. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much for that. So we see that Carla is back online. And Carla, we're really interested in hearing your perspective. So if you'd want to wrap up this panel, we can go back to your slides and kind of pick up where you left off.
Okay, that will be great. I'm sorry about the issues with the communication. That I will be like thankful if you told me where did I live, like when did you stop hearing me?
I think if you wanted to kind of pick up just wrapping up the slide and then kind of,
okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. I was telling you that as a consequence of the mentioned results, CPAC noticed some of the common issues of senior citizens in Central America, among others, invisibility of elderly LGBTI people and persistence of heterosexism. We verified that no one health and care center nor authorities in charge of caring of older people have made any effort to include LGBTI people needs. On awareness of LGBTI senior citizens' needs, both in care and health centers, there's a lack of knowledge of specific needs that have to be considered when treating an LGBTI person. They're assumed to be heterosexual, thus excluding them from the system. Isolation. LGBTI people in Central America have been living in fear of rejection because of the conservatism that prevails in these countries, causing many people to form heterosexual relationships and to hide their real sexual orientation, therefore to accept life in denial. Those people who decide to come out at an advanced age after they live decades pretending to be heterosexual risk suffering a stronger rejection from their families, peers, and society. care centers for elderly people. Societies all over the world are facing a continuous process of demographic aging. The public policies in our countries do not include comprehensive aging programs, leaving us unprepared for the growth of the elderly population and as part of this situation of the elderly LGBTI population. Our policies and programs are out of date and when it comes to human rights and new models of active aging. In the region, the attention and care of the elderly population is only addressed in an asylum system, which makes it difficult to include new programs of care for LGBTI elders. Senior citizens suffer from different kinds of vulnerabilities, but if you are an elderly LGBTI person, maybe with HIV or an STD, the discrimination increases and the care centers don't find themselves prepared to attend them. Rights. In Central America, there is no law that officially recognizes a relationship between same-sex partners. So, the partners cannot live together in any care centers, and according to the rules, they cannot accept visits from the same-sex partners. The LGBTI elderly, like all the LGBTI population in our countries, have patrimonial vulnerability. For instance, in case of death, property acquired together between a same-sex couple will not automatically go to the surviving partner. Instead, the passed one's family is legally eligible to claim the property and possible pensions, leaving the partner with less financial means. Organizations in Central America had been seeking financial support to attend those needs and open a new space to talk about LGBTI seniors in Central America, thanks to our contributor Bread for the World from Germany, CPAC in Costa Rica, SMULES in El Salvador, and HMT in Panama are able to undertake innovative activities using our bonds with stakeholders, other NGOs, professionals, elderly people, and care centers. Our work is focused on creating a structural change, first in the policies and programs of the institutions that attend our groups, and later on the care centers' regulations, so they can identify critical situations of discrimination and support LGBTI people. We are trying to validate a methodology that to capacitate and sensitize healthcare providers and professionals who work in the centers. We expect a rising awareness and visibility of elderly LGBTI communities, their rights and their needs. During the development of our project, we have found that in all three countries there is interest among the stakeholders to make political changes and introduce the subject into their institutions, which is a very important signal in our countries, especially since this is the first time that this topic is approached in Central America. In the past, the segregative and discriminatory discourse in our countries has blocked access to information. This lack of awareness has been fertile ground from the reproduction of prejudices and stereotypes, a situation that has to change. We hope to continue our work in the region and validate tools that can be used in any Latin American country to make visible our elderly LGBTI population and their needs. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. We feel so happy to exchange our reality and our strategies to introduce this topic in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Panama. We at CPAC would like to join the call of SAGE and IFA to shed light on the situation of elderly LGBTI people in our countries and our region, and thus seeking social change for the real inclusion.
Thank you, Carla, for that. That was excellent. So that wraps up our panel. Again, I just want to remind people that if they have any questions, that they are welcome to send them through the chat box. All right, well, while we're waiting for folks to ask some questions, I actually have a few questions. So my first question, I guess I'm going to direct this question to Leslie. So I find it really interesting to see that there's a lot of similarities across Canada, Costa Rica, and the U.S. based on these presentations. In your experience, what are some of the differences that you've seen across different contexts?
In terms of what I've just heard from Michael and Carla?
Yeah.
So I find it interesting, Carla, that from what you've described, you are really struggling to get any kind of recognition for LGBTQ individuals, seniors, couples. What I would like to point out that even though Canada seems to be so progressive in terms of how we work with and how we treat our LGBTQ seniors, a lot of it is on paper and not in practice. So we are actually having some of the same struggles. One of the things you talked about, it was in terms of property, joint property with people of same gender. We are having that same problem happening now in Toronto that I'm aware of. And also we have made some strides forward. But in terms of our care now, as we are getting older, we might as well be back in the dark ages, because I think Michael pointed out, or somebody just pointed out, that when you get to be a certain age, you're no longer seen as a sexual human being. And as LGBTQ seniors, we're not even seen as, beings in the world. We become so invisible. And that's something we all seem to have in common, is that our needs are just not being met because we are being forced back into the closet.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Leslie. Michael, do you have anything to add to this?
I think the theme of invisibility is a very, very important one. Certainly, that has been a very powerful theme in the U.S., and it seems from what both Leslie and Carla have shared that it's a theme in Canada and Costa Rica as well. I mean, we see this notion of invisibility as being really a theme across elders in general, but even more so with regard to LGBTQ elders, and sadly, I think we have to fight really hard to push back against that invisibility, and also to ensure that the visibility and the attention that we're starting to attract can be maintained. And certainly in the U.S. at this moment, that's a particular challenge in light of the emerging policies of our new federal government.
Thanks, Michael, for those thoughts. We have just received a question through our chat box. The question reads, I have seen several long-term care facilities in Toronto advertise as quote-unquote LGBTQ friendly. Is there an evaluation tool in place to check if they indeed are? And if not, is this topic covered in an LGBT elder housing strategy? Leslie, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'm so happy to answer that question. There are 10 long-term care facilities in Toronto that are funded by the City of Toronto, and they're all mandated to be LGBTQ friendly, inclusive, but they are not, because they're not being held accountable. Only 2 of them are actually LGBTQ friendly. Those are True Davidson Acres and Fudger House. The other 8 are still out there grazing in the field, and the Senior Pride Network has been working with Councillor Josh Matlow to make sure that somebody somewhere is holding the other 10 accountable. Now, there are private long-term care facilities, and the Senior Pride Network and the 519 have been working with some of the private LTCs. But in terms of the city LTCs, no, they're not following through on what they're supposed to be doing, and that's something that the Senior Pride Network is trying to, work with the city to actually make sure the city is holding their own employees accountable.
Thanks, Leslie. I appreciate your thoughts. I actually want to flip that question back to Michael and Carla. What have you seen, particularly in long-term care, if anything, around LGBTQ strategies, and how have they been implemented, and what's that reception been like?
I can jump in. In the U.S., we're starting to see some significant progress. We have at SAGE over the last 6 years, we've had a partnership with the U.S. Administration on Aging to build a cultural competency training program that more and more long-term care providers are taking advantage of. And so, and through that training and technical assistance, these providers are starting to build their capacity to work effectively with LGBTQ elders. The thing that's key, though, is this has to be a serious commitment. You know, it's not a one-time, 1 hour, half-day training. That's not going to do the trick. It has to be ongoing, sustained culture change. And fortunately, we're starting to see some providers move in that direction in the U.S.
Thanks, Michael. Carla, do you have anything to add?
Yes. Yes, well, here in Costa Rica, this is the first time that is included these subjects in care facilities. We are promoting trainings at some of the care facilities, but we don't have the capacity to cover all the care facilities. But we are like promoting and creating these methodologies to have the opportunity to extend our effort to work with the care centers. But this is the first time, and we are trying to promote political changes and structural changes at the care facilities. But this is like the first time and that this work has been made with the facilities. They are like usually like private centers, so they don't have like any process of validation of their quality services. So this is like the first time that we have this some kind of well, this is the first time that here in Costa Rica and in El Salvador and in Panama, we're like trying to work in these subjects, but there is not very common here because they work like they want. So we're like making a big effort to make these changes at these care facilities.
Thanks, Carla. I really appreciate your thoughts on that. So we're gonna ask one more question. On the topic of training and resources, and then we're going to wrap up. So we'll finish closer to about 10:05. So our final question is, do you have any resources to share for LGBTQI2S inclusion 101 trainings for seniors? I can speak to that a little bit on behalf of EGAL. So we do 101 trainings. Our portfolio for seniors is still in its infancy, so we're actually still in the development phase. But Leslie, you might have something to speak to with your connections to the 519. So I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, thanks, Iredell. Yeah, I work with the 519. So the 519 for Michael and Carla, it's an LGBTQ community center. It's the only one in Ontario. And the Senior Pride Network, which I am with, works with the 519 in their older adult education training program. So we do LGBTQ inclusion 101 training, and they always include now the voice and lived experience of an LGBTQ elder. So I've been doing a lot of training with them for home care agencies, hospitals, and private long-term care homes and retirement homes. And between the 519 and the Senior Pride Network, we do have lots of resources to offer. So I'm sure at the end of this session, Iredell will be able to give you the link, so you can contact me directly, Michael also, and Jane Barrett through my email, and I can hook everybody up.
Amazing. Thanks, Leslie. Carla, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would like to invite you to visit our web www.adult-tec.org on our Facebook, and I could give you my email to any question. We're very excited to do this work, and we're very excited to have this opportunity with your organizations, because we really want to make this change happen in our country. And we know that we are starting, but I know that there will be a lot of work, but we are really excited to do it, and we are going to make all the possible effort here in our countries to make this change happen, and to promote the real inclusion of LGBTI elderly people.
Thank you, Carla. I really appreciate that. So, Michael, do you want to do the final wrap-up? I know that SAGE, one of the strengths of SAGE is their inclusion training. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Through our National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, we offer a wide variety of resources that have been developed here in the U.S. for U.S. audiences, but increasingly are being adapted for other contexts. And those resources can be found at our National Resource Center website, which is lgbtagingcenter.org. And folks will find a wide variety of tools and resources at that website.
Amazing. Well, it sounds to me like we all have some resources to share. So maybe one of the things that we'll do when we're done this webinar is we'll send out a resource sheet to the participants so they can kind of further advance their knowledge, I guess. Virginia, do you want to do the takeaways?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Virginia Duarte Walsh. I'm the project lead for the IFA. So the IFA, in co-partnership with EGAL and SAGE, through this webinar series, aims to improve awareness through new learnings of the inequalities experienced by older LGBTQI2S people and build expertise to create solutions. Addressing inequalities of older LGBTQI2S people, the theme of this first webinar and a theme at the next IFA Global Conference on Aging in 2018, is a much-needed conversation, and it's a relatively new conversation for some of us. As discussed today, many older LGBTQI2S people experience a lifetime of different forms of oppressions, including homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, sexism, and ageism. And they're less likely to access services and support through general programs because they fear experiencing severe discrimination and sexual harassment. There are 3 clear takeaway messages and actions from this first webinar. There's insufficient knowledge on the specific needs, cares, and services older LGBTQI2S people require. Thus, adequate services and care provided to older LGBTQI2S people are lacking. There are insufficient laws, policies, and programs in place at a governmental and agency level that protect the rights of older LGBTQI2S people. And there's an urgent need for more research geared towards understanding the challenges faced by older LGBTQI2S people and their specific needs, cares, and services, and an urgent need for governments and agencies to commit in protecting the rights of older LGBTQI2S people by providing adequate support and services that are equitable and cater to their specific needs. With these takeaway messages and actions in mind, the IFA, SAGE, and EGAL invite all of you to join the call for action to respect, protect, and promote the rights, choices, and freedom of older LGBTQI2S people that we are currently drafting. The call for action is grounded on the principles of the Inter-American Declaration of Human Rights for Older Persons and will be formally presented at the IFA 2018 14 Global Conference on Aging. Visit ifa2018.com or conference website to submit an abstract and join many other delegates from around the world to address inequalities, as well as to learn more of the future webinars on this on older LGBTQI2S people. The IFA would like to thank Iredell for moderating the first session and Leslie, Carla, and Michael for their excellent presentations as panelists. As well, thank you for joining us and participating today. Hope you all have a fantastic day.